This is not a show about zombies. This is a show and a story about love. It's a story about two people that are both lost, that find each other, and how they make their way through this world.
HBO's The Last of Us is an adaptation of the video game that came out in 2013, which won numerous awards and captured the hearts of gamers around the world with their incredible gameplay, story, characters, and themes. And when it came to adapting the game into a TV, it may seem that all they did was recreate the game into a live-action show. But if we look closer, it wasn't that simple. Showrunners Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin faced the enormous challenge of adapting a game that took at least 15 hours to complete into a 9-hour season of TV, figuring out which elements to keep and which to be thrown out. But more importantly, they needed to hold on to that essence of the game that resonated with fans, and bring it over to the show with new audiences who have no clue what they are in for. And since the release of Season 1, we can see that they made it work. But how did they do it? How did they successfully turn The Last of Us into a TV show, while many others before had failed? As is the case with many adaptations to screen, whether they be from a book, a play, or a game, the concept seems to always begin at a standalone movie pitch. Before it was turned into an HBO series, Screen Gems attempted to make The Last of Us Part 1 into a film. However, the production company wanted an action film like the Resident Evil series, but Neil was against it. Wanting to stick to the dark and melancholic themes, the project was stuck in development for several years, and Screen Gems eventually abandoned the project, returning the rights to Naughty Dog. As Neil was already working on the screenplay, he realized that TV might be a better format to adapt the game to properly expand on its characters and tell the story of the game that took at least 15 hours to complete. And it was Carter Swan, an executive from IP Expansion at PlayStation, who introduced Neil to Craig Mazin, who created and wrote the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. In an interesting twist of fate, Craig later stated that he tried to contact Neil before, but he declined to take his call. "I blew him off. I didn't know who he was," said Neil Druckmann to The New Yorker. Once they met, the two hit it off, amazed at each other's work, and spent hours talking about the game and how to plan a live-action adaptation. But there still was plenty to overcome.
The easy part was that I got the best story ever told in video games, in my opinion. The trick is to love it. Honestly, it's as simple as that. Love it, and love the characters, love the relationships, love the world, love all the little details, understand it.
The game is set in an infested, post-apocalyptic world, but it isn't really about the infected, the gore, the horror, or action. The Last of Us is a story-driven game about the relationship between a father and a daughter. The greatest fear isn't dying or losing a battle with the infected, but something worse, losing someone that you love, that gives you a meaning, a reason to live. And for our main character, Joel, it was about searching for that purpose after the murder of his child, Sarah.
We're talking about creating an experience of the unconditional love a parents feel for their child. It's a kind of joy you've never known before, but it's a kind of fear you've never known before either, and a kind of pain. And a parent's greatest fear is losing their child.
The fear of losing another daughter and the length that one will go for a child is the essence of this dynamic. Finding ways to echo these themes was something that Craig and Neil sought to do in their adaptation. And to properly translate this into a series, they had to find a balance between staying faithful to the source material and making new changes.
I didn't want to be too precious about everything because I felt like that would hurt the adaptation process, where certain things I knew would have to change when we go from this medium to the other.
It could not be a direct translation of a player moving from point to point driven by engaging gameplay in a show. They had to strip away all its gameplay, combat, and puzzles, and look at segments that needed to be filled with character moments.
It doesn't matter how much you push the envelope, it'll still be stationary.
But this also gave the creators an opportunity to explore further with the show.
Is there a way to get kind of these downbeat moments? Again, wouldn't afford any gameplay, which is why we couldn't do them in the game, but we could put them in the show and really expand on them.
Trading out gameplay and killing enemies for deeper character development and a greater sense of the world around them was something Neil and Craig were excited to explore. But it isn't just swapping gameplay for story elements. They had to know when to deviate. In episode 5, there was an opportunity to deviate and reinforce the themes with the characters of Sam and Henry, having them stand on their own. When the decision was presented to the production team to make Sam deaf, Neil absolutely loved the idea and wished he'd included it in the video game.
And it started from a place of just like, conversation I had with Craig, where like, what if we could use less dialogue?
And by making this smaller change, the producers were able to still reflect the main themes, but to do so in a slightly different way.
I became nervous that there was a mode of communication between Joel and Ellie that I didn't want to feel like I was repeating between Henry and Sam. And it could very easily fall into the trap of exasperated father figure and curious, concerned, scared child figure. And so I was looking for a way to change that mode of communication.
In that same episode, there is also the Battle of Kansas City. In the game, Joel takes control of a sniper rifle and shoots at enemies and a horde of infected. But for the series, they had to do more than to recreate that sequence.
And normally, like a sequence like this is like physical action, and there's a lot of moving parts and there's all sorts of things happening. One of the things he sort of said was, I don't necessarily want this to be just physical action. I want this to be character-based action. I want the character of Joel and the character of Ellie to be the forefront of the viewer's mind.
It was in this sequence that Joel's character develops further, and the themes of fatherhood and love come up again when he is forced to protect Ellie from afar.
When the child clicker comes in to the van, we cut that in such a way that we don't see the child clicker enter the van. We see Joel see that there's something that's entering and it causes him immense distress. And then you see the child clicker coming in and that it was his primary goal to protect her. And in doing so, it shows the viewer that Joel is becoming truly so connected to her that he's starting to not be able to see a world without her.
The largest deviation and allotment of screen time is given to Bill and Frank, which together, in the game, only receive a few references that the player can find while exploring Bill's town.
He was my partner. He's the only idiot that would wear a shirt like that.
In trying to build a world, you often write and define more than what the player's going to experience, so they don't see the edges. And you want to define as much as further than what the player sees.
And this deviation, built off the ambiguity in the games, allows for some of the most powerful scenes and can be pointed to as the call to action for Joel. Up to this point, Tess had just been infected and Joel was left with Ellie. Bill's letter to Joel is so powerful because it tells Joel to protect Ellie and that the only thing that matters in life is love. This slight deviation doesn't change the overall plot or break the story. Instead, it enhances the story and Joel's motivation. It richens the experience and echoes the core themes in a way the games couldn't. But Neil and Craig wanted to go beyond the characters. In the prelude to episodes 1 and 2, we were given a small peek into the world prior to its collapse. We are introduced to the cordyceps fungus and to really build the tension of how much of a threat an outbreak could be. And then, we see firsthand a mycologist react to witnessing one of the first recorded patients infected with the cordyceps fungus in Jakarta, Indonesia, a country on the other side of the world, showing how widespread this has been.
I think we knew we wanted to give a little bit more of an origin story. We wanted to see what it would really be like at the very, very beginning, because we're all pretty smart about this stuff now. And we wanted to show also that it was global, that this wasn't something that was just happening in America. This was the world.
But not all change is plot-based or character-based, but by changing how it is portrayed on the screen. The use of negative space was something that Neil included in the video games, and later told the editors of the show that it was important to include. Letting the camera stop and focus on a character's reaction was a way to establish empathy and build an emotional bond between the viewer and the actors. This is something that was prominent in the game's cutscenes, and later could be observed in HBO's show during particularly emotional portions.
Basically is a nice way of saying no dialogue and just emotions and faces, because what happens in the negative spaces is that the audience is able to connect with the direct emotions of the characters' faces, as opposed to having to process what they're saying simultaneously, which divides your brain.
You're not my daughter.
Early on in the development of The Last of Us, Screen Gems wanted their adaptation to feature more action, resembling the Resident Evil series. But Neil felt that this would distract from what The Last of Us was truly about. When it came to the violence in the game versus the series, at first glance, there is less of it. But on screen, less can often be more.
The violence, in general, the violence is not shown. The violence is implied, and or we try to protect you from the violence because the violence is not the point. The point is what caused it, and so we tried very much to hide violence.
And it was clear that the creators wanted to prioritize character over violence.
One of the things that I wanted to do is to create not just a sense of tension, but an emotional tone. So as the character of Joel's being forced down the stairs, I said, all right, here's the deal. We have to endure it with him. And we have to endure it in this sort of almost metaphysical space where he's wondering, how in the world am I going to get out of this? And then at a certain point, he just stops and says, that's it. I've got to do something, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'm going to basically explode. Typical of how we've approached the show, you don't necessarily see all of the violence happen. When the gunshots happen, the camera immediately pans off of these characters. Because it's about being able to experience the rage of the character versus the violence that is shown.
In stripping down the violence, Neil and Craig could then focus on the important elements that were crucial in building the world, such as the clickers.
If you go into a CGI characterization right off the bat, it just starts to feel like it's not there. So we really wanted to find prosthetics to actually turn somebody into a clicker. We found great performers who could move like clickers and even sound like clickers. And from that point, I think our job was to say, we know what the experience should be like when you first encounter one of these things, which is terror.
Making the decision to use real actors as the clickers instead of using CGI was just one way the producers created an immersive experience, showing how this fungus actually operates in the real world. And giving little tidbits of information makes this world feel all the more real. The show also featured memorable landmarks, like the giraffe scene, exploring the city surrounding the QZ with Joel, Ellie, and Tess, the sweeping landscapes of Wyoming, and even Bill's town, places that we've seen before and are familiar with, mixed in with the apocalyptic nature of the world. Music also plays an important role in the show as a narrative element. Gustavo Santaolalla, the same composer who worked on the games, was brought on to recapture the magic of his tracks for the show.
I think beautiful scores and scores that are used well, it's a way into the subconscious. So it's a way to trigger certain memories or feelings without being explicit about it. So that's where, like in the game and similar in the show, we use that theme again to hark back to that moment when he lost his daughter. And it's a way to tap into that.
Neil and Craig also decided to include a track from the 80s. Depeche Mode's Never Let Me Down Again plays, a song that has significance to the characters and the story itself.
What it's about is I'm taking a ride with my best friend. Now, what he was singing about was drugs. Ellie's about to take a ride with her best friend, and Joel is a dangerous man. And Joel is about to take a ride with his best friend. He doesn't know she's his best friend yet. She's a dangerous little girl. And the whole point is, you're never going to let me down. Now, they are going to let each other down, and then they're not. And then they are, and then they're not. We are going to hear that song again.
Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin knew the importance of balancing faithfulness and making necessary changes to adapt the game into a TV show. It's not just the use of prosthetics and real actors as clickers, or Gustavo Santaollalla's music immersing us into the world, but the focus on story, its themes, and emotion, over action and violence, made us excited to tune in every week to find out what happens to our characters. And it's this attention to detail, and most importantly, understanding the essence of what made the game great, is how Neil Druckmann and Craig Mazin made us fall in love with The Last of Us.
You dick.
But in a show about love, why is there so much hate and violence? Check out this video as we dig deeper into the themes, characters, and the world of The Last of Us.